Let me get this straight. We're filming an episode about World War II and Tom Hanks isn't coming. Must be historically fantastic. Hey folks, welcome to Historically Fantastic, where we take history's complex questions and come up with some straightforward answers. I'm your host, Michael Jacobs. In today's episode, we're going to be asking this question. Was America justified in dropping the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to end World War II? If you grew up in the United States of America and, like me, got U.S. history at least 3 or 4 times, elementary school, middle school, high school, you were probably told that it was justifiable, and the reason was it saved Americans and Japanese lives. There are actually a lot more reasons that the US government and the military used to justify using these weapons and using these weapons on Japanese civilians. We did not use them on the military. What we're going to do is break it down into 4 categories. 1, the argument that it saved lives. 2, the argument that it had to be on civilian targets. 3, the lack of an unconditional Japanese surrender. 4, and probably most interesting, we used it to intimidate the Soviets. Let's dive in. Again, the most commonly used argument as to how it was justifiable was that it saved American and Japanese lives. A little context here. Japan culture was very different than Western culture, especially when it came to warfare. To the Japanese, surrender was not really an option, and they would fight to the death, even when losing was imminent. This is very different than Europe. The Germans surrendered tens of thousands at a time. The Japanese not so much. And by the summer of 1945, America had experienced very difficult fighting at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, fighting inch for inch, tree line by tree line, trying to defeat the Japanese. It took a toll on American soldiers as well as Japanese soldiers. By the summer of 1945, Japan also did not have a navy or an air force. They're out of oil. The American Navy demolished the Japanese Navy, and so the only way of fighting Japan had left was with troops on the ground. And all surrounding islands to Japan had been taken by the Allied forces by August of 1945. Japan was still not surrendering. So the idea was it would take an amphibious landing on the Japanese mainland near probably Tokyo to convince the Japanese to surrender. Here's the problem. The Japanese were talking about arming every able-bodied citizen. Millions of Japanese armed against these US and Allied soldiers. That Japanese culture of never surrendering, it would lead to a long, bloody battle. Winston Churchill himself believed that 1 million Allied forces would lose their lives in any sort of amphibious landing ground invasion of Japan. But here's the problem. The State Department themselves put the estimate around 50,000 American soldiers lost in this landing. And like I said earlier, Japan was crippled at this point. They had no air force, they had no navy. It was only a matter of time before they were going to see the writing on the wall and surrender. Let's go to reason number 2. The idea that we had to use it on a civilian target. There were those at the time who argued, why don't we just drop the bomb on an uninhabited island or in the middle of the ocean? Invite the Japanese leaders to come see this weapon and say, hey guys, if you don't cut out this war, if you don't surrender, this is what we're going to do to you. The counter argument to that by the military, and it kind of makes sense if you think about military strategy and warfare, is that what if we invite them to this uninhabited island to observe this bomb, we drop it, and it doesn't go off. This is brand new technology. Before we dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, we'd only tested 1 nuclear bomb at all in New Mexico. So the idea that it was going to work every time wasn't necessarily the case. If we drop that bomb and it's a dud, we lose credibility, and the Japanese will think we're bluffing. By dropping it on a civilian target, even if it's a dud, none's the wiser. But having it be a civilian target, it sends a very direct message to the Japanese. Here's the problem. We didn't give the Japanese any warning that we had this weapon. Had we told them that we have this unbelievable weapon that you can't even imagine, and we're willing to use it on civilians where tens of thousands of people will die instantly, maybe the Japanese would have considered going to the negotiating table, which They already were, which we'll talk about momentarily. Eisenhower himself, after the fact, said it was misguided to drop these bombs. Let's go on to reason number 3, the lack of an unconditional Japanese surrender. America and the rest of the world kind of got burned after World War I. The Germans lost World War I, and the French and English put a lot of heavy sanctions on them to punish them for the war, but it was not an unconditional surrender. There were conditions that Germany had if they were willing to surrender, which the French and the English and the Americans had to adhere to. As we know, after World War I, it left a crack in the door for Hitler to get his foot in and rise to power, and we had World War II. America doesn't want that after World War II. They want an unconditional Japanese surrender so that post-World War I Europe doesn't happen again in Japan. Why was Japan unwilling to unconditionally surrender? They wanted to try their war criminals in-house in Japan. 2, they wanted to keep their symbolic figurehead, the emperor, in power. Now that first one, it kind of sounds like a big deal. The Japanese committed many war atrocities. The rape of Nanking, they committed a lot of atrocities in the medical field, testing on live subjects, and it's terrible things. The forced prostitution of South Korean women. They wanted to handle all these issues in-house. How can we guarantee that that's going to be a fair trial if their Japanese are being tried by the Japanese? I kind of get that. But letting them keep their emperor, he's a figurehead. He had no real power during World War II. That was actually kind of the problem. The other Japanese leaders were running the show. The emperor had no voice. Leaving the emperor in power would not have been that big of a deal. Which leads me to why this idea that Japan needed to unconditionally surrender is kind of bunk. First off, it was only a matter of time before they were going to surrender. If we wanted to end this war so swiftly, why not give them the conditional surrender and then later on let them pick up the pieces? Kind of seems backwards. There's also very strong evidence that Japan was ready to surrender. They were reaching out to the Soviet Union to be a mediator between America and the Japanese, which often happens when two sides are looking to end the war. They bring in a third country to help mediate. That's how Teddy Roosevelt got his Nobel Peace Prize. He intervened in the Russo-Japanese War. So if Japan was ready to surrender, they were reaching out to the Soviet Union. We wanted a swift end of the war. Why were we so concerned with an unconditional surrender? All right, the fourth reason, I think this is the most intriguing one. We wanted to intimidate Russia. Post-World War II Europe was split in two. You had the East, which was controlled by the Soviets, and you had the West, which was controlled by France, England, and America. Pretty much right after the Germans surrendered, it was obvious that Stalin was going to try to influence these Eastern European countries with communism as much as possible. America didn't want that. England didn't want that. France didn't want that. They wanted these countries to become democratic and capitalistic. We obviously have the rise of two world superpowers post-World War II, America and the Soviet Union. Truman and his military advisors believed that dropping these bombs, showing this American force, would intimidate the Soviets and make them bow to the United States as the world superpower, so everyone knew who the top dog on the block was. Here's the problem with that idea. That implies that America used Japanese civilians' lives to gain international political power. Also, the Soviets promised to intervene 3 months after the end of the war in Europe. Yes, they were going to get involved, but say Japan hadn't surrendered after those 2 nuclear weapons. The Soviets were still going to get involved. It was a gamble. Not a very good reason to drop the bombs. So we've seen the 4 different ideas as to how it was justifiable. Taking all this information, was it justified? Personally, I say no. I lean towards peacekeeping. There are definitely times when war is necessary, i.e. the beginning of World War II. But using Japanese civilian lives to gain political points or to end the war swiftly when Japan was clearly willing to end the war swiftly, just maybe not on the terms that America wanted. It seems that America overstepped the line by instantly killing hundreds of thousands of Japanese and long-term effects. Radiation poisoning in the survivors of the initial blast, the cancer rate in these 2 cities, and setting off the Cold War in the nuclear age, where Americans and the world were in constant fear of being blown up. I don't think it was justifiable. I do, however, respect that Truman put the entirety of this decision on his own shoulders. He took responsibility for the decision that was made, and I gotta give respect to him for that. So, was America justified? I say no. Thanks for watching. Hey guys, thanks for watching today's episode of Historically Fantastic. I hope you found it informative. Please comment below. Do you agree or disagree with me? Did I miss something? Please also subscribe. I've got episodes coming up on Joseph McCarthy, speaking of the Atomic War, Nixon and why he maybe wasn't the worst guy ever. A special shout out in this episode to Rita Caver. She was my mentor in my school where I work, and all the information from this episode pretty much comes from a lesson plan she created that I still give my students in my classroom today. And asking this big question. So thank you, Rita, for all this great information. Thanks for watching.